The grand citadel of Oakhaven smelled of ozone and institutional failure. Across the courtyard, the Vylrari Imperial Guard stood like obsidian statues, their towering, scale-plated frames radiating a cold authority that had subjugated half the known galaxy. Yet, inside the obsidian walls, an invisible terror was systematically dismantling the ruling class. The high-caste nobility were succumbing to a rapid, wasting paralysis that baffled the Empire's finest synthetic medical arrays. Scans returned completely blank, registering no foreign pathogens, no toxins, and no cellular anomalies. The medical bays hummed with silent panic as high-ranking officials simply locked up, their nervous systems freezing in real time while alien science stood utterly helpless. Amidst this high-tech crisis sat Lyra, a low-ranking culinary specialist assigned to the sub-level human embassy kitchens. Lyra was an anomaly among the hardened crew, remarkably youthful, with bright, expressive eyes and a calm demeanor that sharply contrasted with the frantic energy of the military personnel around her. While the diplomats argued over whether the paralysis was an undetected biological weapon or a targeted political assassination, Lyra spent her hours organizing simple pantry staples. She didn't possess a military background or a degree in xenobiology, but she possessed an innate, profound understanding of how organic bodies responded to stress, environment, and basic nourishment. The tipping point arrived when word leaked from the central spire that the Emperor himself had fallen. The imperial court plunged into absolute chaos, and radical military factions began whispering of retaliation against humanity, convinced that the unseen sickness was an act of war. As alarms echoed through the monolithic corridors, Lyra stared down at a container of organic root vegetables and dried fowl carcasses shipped from Earth. She knew that if the Emperor perished, the fragile peace treaty would disintegrate into an interplanetary slaughterhouse. With quiet resolve, she abandoned her standard prep list, ignited the induction stove, and began preparing a recipe that defied every protocol of the Interstellar Alliance. The kitchen doors flew open with a heavy metallic hiss, revealing Chancellor Vral, a senior Vylrari minister whose scarred carapace and jagged crest marked him as a hardliner of the old guard. Vral's multi-spectrum eyes locked onto Lyra with palpable contempt as he watched her chop root vegetables with a standard ceramic blade. To Vral, humans were a volatile, biologically inferior species whose very presence in the sacred kitchens was an insult to imperial dignity. He immediately stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the low prep table, demanding to know why an unauthorized human was handling rations designated for the royal staff during a national emergency. Lyra did not shrink back from the towering official. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and met his intense gaze head-on, explaining that the high-tech medical scans were failing because they were looking for a disease rather than a systemic collapse. She argued that the Vylrari elite, sustained entirely by synthetic, hyper-refined energy pastes and trapped under crushing administrative stress, were experiencing a total neurological burnout coupled with a severe, localized nutritional deficiency. Vral scoffed at the notion, barking that the royal family would rather perish than ingest primitive, unsterilized organic matter prepared by a human. He ordered her away from the burners and commanded the security details to seal the kitchen permanently. The standoff escalated as the intercom crackled with updates from the Royal Medical Wing, reporting that the Emperor had entered the final, unresponsive stages of paralysis. Realizing that bureaucratic stubbornness was going to cost thousands of lives, Lyra made a split-second, high-stakes decision. She calmly looked past the furious Chancellor and reminded him that his traditional protocols had yielded zero results for 3 weeks. With a swift movement, she bypassed the frozen security guard, grabbed her steaming stockpot, and bolted toward the private royal elevator before Vral could issue an execution order. The race against time had officially begun, and she was entirely on her own. The private royal wing was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, ominous hum of life support monitors casting a pale blue glow across the vaulted chamber. Armed guards flanked the massive mahogany doors, their long, trembling fingers resting on plasma rifles as they watched Lyra approach with the smoking pot cradled in her arms. Vral, having sprinted up the service stairs, burst into the corridor just behind her, screaming for the guards to neutralize the trespasser immediately. But before the security detail could raise their weapons, Lyra stepped directly into the Emperor's bedchamber, using her precise timing and absolute composure to freeze the room in a state of suspended disbelief. Inside the sprawling suite, the Emperor lay rigid upon an obsidian platform, his massive frame locked in a terrifying posture of total paralysis. Eminent alien physicians hovered around him like anxious ghosts, clutching diagnostic slates that continuously flashed warning errors. As Lyra approached the bedside, the physicians hissed in outrage, warning that the intense aromatic compounds radiating from the pot would trigger an immediate anaphylactic shock in Vylrari physiology. Vral lunged forward to physically drag her away, his claws inches from her shoulder, when a faint, raspy sound echoed from the bed. It was a weak, involuntary gasp from the Emperor, signaling that his consciousness was slipping away into the void. Ignoring the chaos erupting behind her, Lyra ladled a small amount of the golden broth into a shallow ceramic bowl and knelt beside the imperial platform. The aroma of simmering poultry, garlic, carrots, and a precise blend of earth herbs immediately filled the sterile room, cutting through the scent of ozone and antiseptic. It was an entirely foreign sensory experience for beings whose palates had been chemically optimized for centuries. With steady hands, Lyra lifted the bowl to the Emperor's lips, knowing that a single drop could either save the fragile interstellar alliance or ignite a war that would burn the stars to ash. The moment the warm golden liquid touched the Emperor's lower mandibles, the entire chamber held its breath in absolute, agonizing suspense. Vral froze mid-stride, his weapon lowered, while the royal physicians leaned in with their diagnostic slates fully active, waiting for the inevitable biological rejection. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The Emperor's massive frame remained rigid, and his multispectrum eyes stayed clouded with the gray film of approaching death. The silence was so profound that the hum of the life support machines sounded like roaring thunder against the stone walls of the private suite. Then, a subtle shift occurred beneath the Emperor's dark-plated shell. The complex amino acids, natural sodium, and warm hydration hit his starved neural receptors like an electrical spark jumping a gap. His throat muscles twitched, an involuntary biological reflex that had been entirely absent during weeks of synthetic intravenous feeding. The steam carrying the rustic earth spices seemed to unlock dormant olfactory pathways deep within his ancient biology, triggering an ancestral memory of organic nourishment that predated the Empire's spacefaring era. A faint, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and the gray film over his eyes began to recede. The diagnostic slates in the physician's hands suddenly flared from crimson warning red to a steady, pulsing emerald green. The Emperor's neurological monitors spiked as electrochemical impulses cascaded down his spine, breaking the stress-induced paralysis loop that had baffled the best minds in the galaxy. Before the stunned medical staff could issue a command, the Emperor swallowed the spoonful of broth entirely on his own. The heavy, oppressive tension in the room instantly fractured, replaced by the unmistakable, miraculous warmth of a life pulled back from the absolute brink of oblivion. Within minutes of consuming the initial broth, the structural paralysis gripping the Emperor began to visibly unwind. His massive fingers, locked in rigid tension for weeks, slowly uncurled against the obsidian sheets. The color returning to his crest transformed the dull gray of systemic failure back into a healthy, iridescent blue-gold sheen. The royal physicians scrambled backward in sheer disbelief, frantically tapping their diagnostic equipment to confirm that the impossible was actually happening. The alien science that had declared the condition incurable was now being systematically dismantled by a simple, home-cooked meal prepared in a basement embassy kitchen. Chancellor Vral stared at the recovering monarch, his expression shifting from furious arrogance to profound, unsettling shock. He looked from the Emperor down to the modest bowl of soup in Lyra's hands, struggling to reconcile his deep-seated prejudice against humanity with the undeniable physical evidence before his eyes. The Emperor's jaw clicked as he forced his vocal cords to vibrate, producing a low, resonant tone that required no mechanical translator to convey its immense authority. He called out Lyra's name, a sound he had never uttered before, commanding everyone in the room to stand down and give space to the human healer. As the Emperor pushed himself up from the platform, supported by his own newly restored musculature, the political landscape of the entire empire shifted. The radical factions waiting in the wings for a power vacuum were suddenly silenced by the miraculous recovery of their supreme leader. Lyra stepped back respectfully, setting the ceramic bowl down on a nearby console, but the Emperor's gaze remained locked onto her with intense curiosity. He realized that the greatest crisis in the history of the Vylrari Empire hadn't been solved by a high-tech weapon or a brilliant diplomat, but by a young human girl armed with nothing more than a wooden spoon and a time-tested family recipe. News of the miracle in the royal bedchamber spread through the citadel faster than any official broadcast, igniting a firestorm across the interplanetary network. While ordinary Vylrari citizens celebrated the recovery of their sovereign with overwhelming relief, the High Council chambers became a battlefield of paranoia and political maneuvering. Chancellor Vral and his faction convened an emergency secret assembly, arguing that the sudden turnaround was not a medical recovery, but a psychological ploy, a sophisticated form of biological dependency designed to infiltrate the highest tiers of the imperial lineage. They whispered darkly about human witchcraft and chemical control. Lyra, meanwhile, was escorted back to her quarters under heavy guard, though the nature of her detention had fundamentally changed. She was no longer treated as a low-level kitchen worker, but as a high-value asset of unknown origin. Human diplomats back on Earth flooded the embassy with frantic encrypted messages, demanding to know what classified bioagent Lyra had released into the alien court. They feared that the fragile ceasefire would shatter if the Vylrari public discovered a foreign substance had cured their leader. Lyra spent those quiet hours alone in her room, calmly peeling more root vegetables, entirely unfazed by the geopolitical storm raging around her name. The turning point of the council session arrived when the Emperor himself walked into the assembly hall unannounced, leaning slightly on a ceremonial staff but radiating absolute physical health. He silenced the panicking ministers with a single gesture of his hand, cutting off Vral's impassioned speech about human treachery. The Emperor declared that any council member who prioritized ancient xenophobic pride over the survival of the crown would be stripped of their titles. He announced that he was formally summoning the human cook back to the royal chambers, not as a prisoner of state, but as an honored guest invited to share the true secrets of human heritage. Summoned once again to the private quarters, Lyra walked through the vaulted corridors without hesitation, carrying a fresh, larger basket of ingredients. When she entered, the Emperor was sitting by the grand viewing window, watching the distant twin suns set over the capital skyline. He motioned for her to sit across from him, a gesture of absolute equality that stunned the attending guards. Without the formal barriers of statecraft, the towering apex predator spoke to the young human girl with a disarming vulnerability, asking the question that had consumed his thoughts. How could something so simple accomplish what 1,000 years of advanced science could not? Lyra smiled softly and explained that the secret wasn't a hidden chemical formula or an advanced medical compound. She explained the concept of comfort, heritage, and the biological necessity of warmth during times of extreme stress. She told him about her grandmother, who made the exact same soup during harsh winters back on Earth, proving that physical healing often begins when the mind feels safe and nurtured. The Emperor listened intently, his multi-spectrum eyes absorbing every word as he realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their combat prowess or their starships, but their capacity to care deeply for others, even across vast, alien divides. As they shared the quiet meal together, the foundational barriers between their two species began to crumble away piece by piece. Vral and the traditionalists outside the door could plot and scheme all they wanted, but the undeniable bond forged over a simple bowl of soup had changed the trajectory of interstellar history. The Emperor reached a quiet, profound realization. The universe was filled with empires built on dominance and fear, but humanity had survived and thrived because they weaponized radical empathy. The stage was now set for a permanent, unbreakable alliance, born not from a treaty signed in ink, but from a kitchen filled with the aroma of home. While peace took root in the royal wing, a darker plot was quietly unraveling in the subterranean levels of the citadel. Chancellor Vral, desperate to reclaim his eroding political power and preserve the ancient purity of the Vylrari elite, had been secretly communicating with extremist military factions. His goal was to discredit the human cook entirely by fabricating evidence that the chicken soup was actually a slow-acting neurotoxin engineered to make the royal family compliant to human rule. Vral compiled doctored chemical logs and forged witness statements from the attending physicians, preparing to launch a coup during the upcoming planetary summit. The conspiracy came to light when a sympathetic young Vylrari kitchen attendant, who had watched Lyra prepare the meals with genuine care, discovered Vral's encrypted data files in the administrative terminal. Horrified by the impending betrayal, the attendant bypassed security and slipped a physical data drive into Lyra's supply basket just before her morning delivery to the royal suite. When Lyra found the drive, the full scope of Vral's treasonous plot laid bare before her eyes. She realized that the danger to the ceasefire wasn't a misunderstanding between species, but the desperate greed of a corrupt politician clinging to a dying way of life. Without panicking, Lyra handed the data drive directly to the Emperor's personal guard detail upon entering the royal chambers. The evidence of Vral's conspiracy was immediately brought before the sovereign, whose fury shook the very foundations of the obsidian citadel. The Emperor did not need to shout; his cold, calculated wrath was enough to mobilize the loyalist guard units across the entire planet. Vral's plan collapsed in an instant as heavily armed Imperial soldiers descended upon the council chambers, arresting the conspirators before they could fire a single shot or broadcast their fabricated lies to the public. With the conspirators neutralized and the royal health fully restored, the Grand Planetary Summit commenced under a renewed spirit of genuine cooperation. Delegates from dozens of allied and former enemy systems crowded into the massive amphitheater, their murmurs echoing off the crystalline walls. The primary agenda of the summit was no longer a fragile, enforced ceasefire, but a permanent integration treaty between humanity and the Vylrari Empire. Holographic displays beamed the historic proceedings across thousands of worlds, turning the capital planet into the focal point of galactic history. Lyra stood quietly on the observation deck, watching the historic proceedings unfold far below her. She wore a simple diplomatic observer uniform, choosing to remain in the background despite the massive public adoration she had unexpectedly received across the media streams. Human diplomats, once deeply skeptical of her reckless kitchen intervention, now praised her as the architect of a new golden age. Yet, Lyra remained grounded, focusing entirely on the simple task of ensuring the embassy kitchens were well stocked and running smoothly for the delegates arriving for the post-summit banquet. During the summit's closing remarks, the Emperor took the central podium, commanding the absolute attention of the entire assembly. Instead of focusing solely on political trade routes or military defense pacts, he dedicated a significant portion of his address to the small human cook who had saved his life. He recounted the story of the Six-Day Plague, the failure of advanced alien medicine, and the profound lesson taught by a bowl of simple chicken soup. The amphitheater erupted into thunderous applause, a monumental moment where two radically different civilizations united in shared understanding, laughter, and mutual respect. The final chapter of the crisis settled into a peaceful, enduring routine that transformed the very fabric of interplanetary relations. The Vylrari Embassy kitchens became a bustling cultural exchange hub, where human culinary traditions and alien organic synthesis merged into an entirely new gastronomic art form. High-ranking officials and ordinary citizens alike frequently requested Lyra's signature dishes, recognizing that comfort and empathy were far more powerful tools for unity than any plasma rifle or political decree could ever hope to be. The lingering resentment of the old guard faded away, replaced by a lasting cultural bridge between worlds. Lyra eventually transitioned from a culinary specialist to the head cultural ambassador of the Human Vylrari Coalition, traveling across the galaxy to teach other alien species the universal language of care and nourishment. Her humble background as a cook remained her greatest badge of honor, a constant reminder that grand historical shifts often hinge on the smallest, most human gestures of kindness. She maintained a close, enduring friendship with the Emperor and young Princess Pipian, who grew up visiting the embassy kitchens regularly to learn the secrets of earth spices and hearty broths. As the twin suns set over the obsidian citadel one peaceful evening, Lyra stood by the grand viewing window of the royal suite, holding a warm ceramic bowl of soup while looking out over a united, thriving galactic civilization. The war that had once torn their worlds apart felt like a distant, faded memory, overshadowed by a future built on shared warmth, resilience, and mutual survival. She smiled quietly to herself, knowing that the greatest HFY story ever told wasn't written with the blood of conquest, but with the steam of a simple, comforting meal shared among friends. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.